Manuela pushed her shopping cart ahead, placing groceries inside. The supermarket wasn't too crowded, allowing her to navigate through people easily. At the same time, she glanced at her list, ensuring she had everything while mentally calculating if she had enough money. After adding it all up, she confidently headed to the checkout, believing it would suffice, especially since she had only taken a little of each item, avoiding extravagance. Lately, she needed to be more frugal as her salary was catastrophically low and every cent mattered. Manuela kept this in mind, avoiding unnecessary expenses, but she couldn't deny her kids an occasional treat as they weren't responsible for the family's financial struggles. With quick steps, she approached the register, unaware of what awaited her. Her intuition, usually alerting her to danger, was quiet today. With a calm mind, she wheeled her cart to the conveyor belt. To her surprise, the cashier announced the total, revealing she was a bit short on cash. "Ma'am, you're holding up the line. Let's speed this up," a voice called from behind. Several people crowded around, all staring, except for an elderly man desperately trying to gather coins. Manuela hoped until the last moment that she could muster the necessary amount, but the cashier was losing patience and made a snide remark about how these beggars have completely lost their minds coming to the store without money. Finally, Manuela realized she couldn't pay for everything and began hastily selecting which items to forego. Thoughts raced through her mind. Maybe the milk or the cookies, but the kids loved them. Perhaps she'd skip the pasta. Doubts tormented her as she struggled to decide what to leave behind. Meanwhile, the line, fueled by the cashier's comments, started to grumble too. Manuela was ready to abandon everything and flee to escape those malicious stares. Tears filled her eyes, and she barely held back a full cry. She had come to the store for groceries and ended up in this embarrassing situation. Never before had she felt so humiliated in front of others. What must they think of me? These were the very thoughts racing through her mind when unexpectedly something happened that no one anticipated. The same elderly man from the line, who had been quiet, pulled out his wallet and handed her the money. The bill landed in the cashier's hands with an annoyed grunt. She seemed unable to make a scene about someone helping. Still, she seized the chance to remark, "No need to help these scammers," pointing dismissively at Manuela. "They're used to living off others, just waiting for the right moment to deceive a trusting person." Manuela felt deeply ashamed, wishing she could vanish when openly called a scammer. Her face flushed and her hands clenched so tightly that her skin nearly cracked. If it weren't for the onlookers and the surveillance camera, Manuela would have unleashed her thoughts on that woman, quickly packing her groceries. Manuela placed her groceries into bags and thanked the man before heading toward the exit. However, just before reaching the door, she turned around and said, "I will return everything, you can be sure of that." Manuela genuinely appreciated the stranger for helping her in a tough moment, saving her from embarrassment. It was hard to imagine how things might have ended if he hadn't intervened to halt the cashier's stream of offensive remarks, especially since she had intended to continue humiliating her. Strangely, no one in line, aside from her savior, lifted a finger to admonish the insensitive cashier. Struggling under the weight of her grocery bags, tears kept streaming down Manuela's face, but she didn't notice. What had begun as a decent day had turned dark. Just 1 or 2 hours ago, she had been in good spirits, planning to cook oatmeal with milk for her kids and treat them to sugar cookies with tea. Now her emotional state had soured. Meanwhile, after waiting for Manuela to exit, the man who had helped approached the cashier and confidently stated, "You should temper your zeal, my dear. Who do you think you are to behave this way?" "And who are you?" the cashier snapped back. "I know you're new here, but I happen to own this supermarket chain, and this store is also mine. Remember that and conduct yourself appropriately." In the commotion, the cashier hurriedly replied, and upon recognizing the store owner, immediately began to fawn over him. "Oh, Mr. Silva, you're here. We thought you were on a business trip." "I had to return to check on my property," he replied angrily. "What happened here is absolutely unacceptable." "What is it, Mr. Silva?" asked the senior cashier, feigning innocence. "Your protégé insulted customers," he pointed out, "and to make matters worse, she didn't have enough money to cover her groceries and was ready to leave items behind. Yet you refused to wait or seemed to be in a rush and started calling her indecent names in front of everyone. How dare you?" "I'm sorry," the cashier said, lowering her head in shame. "I won't do it again, I promise. I was just trying to move the line along." "Be careful with your actions, or you'll find yourself out of a job," Mr. Silva warned. "That's enough for now. Let's forgive her this time," Eduardo intervened. "But make sure it doesn't happen again. I won't allow customers to be humiliated in my stores. Pass that message along to the rest of the team so I don't have to fire anyone suddenly." "Understood," replied the cashier, looking annoyed. "I'll print a memo immediately and distribute it to all staff. Please don't fire me. Let this be the last resort." "Fine, but it's your responsibility," Eduardo warned, pointing a finger at her. Expressions of surprise spread through the line as it became clear that the cashier had taken out her frustrations on an ordinary customer, which often occurs in other stores. But the owner stood by Manuela's side. It was shocking, and it could be said that Eduardo Silva was a patron or simply a genuinely kind person. "Would you like a coffee? I just brewed some," the cashier offered the store owner. "Not now. I have too much to sort out," Eduardo replied, shaking his head. As they exited the supermarket, Eduardo caught up with Manuela and offered to help with her bags. "Let me carry those. They look heavy and it won't bother me," he said. "Oh, you don't need to. I can manage on my own," Manuela replied with a heavy sigh, yet she handed him one of the bags. "I apologize for not introducing myself earlier. My name is Eduardo Silva," he said. "I'm Manuela," she responded. "Thanks again for your help. If it weren't for you, I would have been overwhelmed with shame right there." "Don't worry about it, it can happen to anyone," Eduardo replied. As Manuela looked at him, she noticed his thin, pale frame, but he was dressed respectably and didn't seem like an ordinary person. He appeared quite well off. Eduardo quickly picked up on her gaze and said, "I own a supermarket chain, and this is one of them." "Are you serious?" Manuela asked, surprised. "Yes, I do periodic checks on how my employees are doing. Today, I decided to come here, and it seems I made the right choice," he explained, his tone serious. "It's interesting to investigate your own properties undercover," Manuela commented with a hint of amusement. "You always need to keep a close eye, otherwise they'll sense weakness and take advantage," Eduardo replied with irritation in his voice. "I understand," she agreed, "but don't worry, I'll return every cent." "Relax, I said you don't need to repay anything," Eduardo insisted firmly. "I don't care about that money." Manuela felt reassured. She could trust him. Despite their social differences, Eduardo acted nobly. Without realizing it, she began to open up about her life, and he listened attentively, responding with sympathy. It felt as though they had quickly found common ground and became good friends. "I grew up in a poor family and learned the value of money from a young age," Manuela shared. "We didn't have much, so we had to save wherever we could. My mother worked as a meal carrier and my father died in a workplace accident. Unfortunately, no one in management helped with his funeral. He dedicated many years to that factory, and in the end, they didn't even provide a wreath for his grave." "I'm sorry to hear that," Eduardo said. "I tend to speak my mind," Manuela continued. At that moment, Eduardo sighed deeply, looking unwell. "Are you okay? Should I call an ambulance?" Manuela asked. "I'm fine, I'll push through. Please continue." "Well, my mother raised me alone," she resumed. "She did everything she could to make sure we had the basics to eat. I won't lie. We didn't have much, but I don't regret living that way. It made me stronger." "That's what matters," he replied. "You faced hardships, but didn't give up. Many people I know have struggled to find their way and sunk to the bottom of society. I married young, and that's how it went," Manuela continued. "My husband was a good man, and everyone praised me back then, saying I had won the lottery of happiness. But what mattered most was that we were compatible in character." Eduardo empathized with her, then gazed into the distance as if he spotted someone. Manuela squinted, trying to see, but there was nothing ahead on the road. The area around them felt deserted, as if everyone had vanished in an instant. Eduardo shook his head, as if to clear away an invisible web, then turned to Manuela with a smile. "I've been listening to you and didn't even notice the silence that fell." "Yes, I got lost in my thoughts too," Manuela admitted, recalling her marriage to Andre. "We had 4 children. We were the happiest parents." Eduardo asked cautiously, "Why are you speaking in the past tense?" Manuela lowered her gaze and whispered, "My husband passed away." Eduardo involuntarily stepped back, thinking she might continue sharing how they raised their children and cherished every moment together. Instead, this seemingly delicate woman had endured significant sorrows in her life, and the incident at the store only deepened her distress. After a brief pause, she spoke of her family. Her husband was a construction worker whose skills were highly valued. It was after the birth of their youngest daughter that he began contemplating a job change. Andre wanted to earn more, feeling financially secure at home, and dreamed of owning a house where they could all live comfortably, with rooms for the kids and spaces to play. With that vision in mind, Andre decided to work abroad. Manuela, of course, didn't fully agree with the idea, but didn't oppose it either. She trusted her husband completely, believing he must have weighed all options. Manuela had long wanted to improve their lives, especially for their children, so they would never face hardships. With her support, Andre embarked on his journey, confident that success awaited him. The anxious wait stretched on for 2 months, during which Manuela called him almost daily to check in. Initially, he would answer right away, but eventually, he only replied when he had free time. During this period, Manuela's heart began to fill with anxiety, not about infidelity, but about his well-being. She never doubted Andre's loyalty, especially since he gave her no reason to. Then, unexpectedly, she received the tragic news that her husband had died in a car accident. His supervisor explained that Andre had taken a few weeks off to visit family, but had decided against waiting for the company transport and opted to hitch a ride. Naturally, all his co-workers had urged him not to do this, but he didn't want to lose precious time, especially since the company bus was scheduled to arrive 3 days later. This decision turned out to be his fatal mistake. Halfway through the journey, the driver of the truck he was riding lost control on a curve, and the vehicle plunged into a river at high speed. The truck driver died on the spot, never regaining consciousness, and Andre's body was never found. Despite several days of searching, they couldn't locate him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Eventually, the search was called off, presuming Andre had drowned, and that his body would be impossible to recover. She was a widow with 4 children to care for, and accepting this new reality was undeniably difficult. It seemed that fate had chosen this path for her. Manuela spent days crying incessantly, and despite her family and loved ones trying to comfort her, nothing seemed effective. All she could do was watch her emotional turmoil and pray to God to keep her sanity intact, especially since her husband's body was never found. Manuela had to bury an empty casket filled with his belongings. She placed new clothes that Andre had never worn inside the coffin, a beautiful suit he had intended to wear for his birthday celebration. She also included his black leather shoes, as Andre loved classic style and valued elegance. Manuela didn't hesitate to part with these items as a way to honor him and say goodbye. She wanted to keep him as a cherished memory. About a year had passed since then, and Manuela seemed to have adjusted somewhat to the absence of her husband. The children no longer bothered her with questions about their dad. Initially, they threw tantrums demanding to see him, finding it hard to comprehend that he was in heaven. Only recently did they stop pestering their mother, fully grasping the loss of their father. Manuela poured her heart out to Eduardo Silva, revealing emotions she had held in for so long. The store owner didn't rush to interrupt with his own comments. He walked alongside her, lost in thought. Manuela sensed that Eduardo was in a different world at that moment. The skin on his face was so taut that all his veins and capillaries were visible. Regardless of what people say, even wealthy individuals are not devoid of compassion. Eduardo seemed deeply moved by her story, envisioning it to the point of not noticing when she took out a photo of her husband from her sweater pocket. "Here's my André," she said, pointing at him through tears and handing the picture to Eduardo. He studied the photo for several minutes, as if searching for something familiar within it. In the image, André was smiling, as happy people do, with no reason not to be. He had a home and a loving wife. The photo captured him in full height, with defined features of a joyful person. "I feel for you," Eduardo finally spoke after a long silence. "It's a tragedy for a family when a loved one is lost." "Thank you for your compassion," Manuela replied, feeling the weight of his words. "Time heals, as they say," she continued. "Maybe, but not everyone can manage that," Eduardo replied, sadness lacing his voice. "By the way, if you'd like, I can help search for your husband, even though the rescue teams found nothing." Manuela responded doubtfully. "It's unlikely you'll succeed." "I'll try. Perhaps we can at least locate his body," Eduardo insisted. "Who knows? Someone might have seen something or have information." "I would be grateful to you," Manuela said. "You've already done me a kindness. I don't know how to thank you." "It's not necessary. I truly want to help," Eduardo replied, winking with his left eye. Time to heal and cut things at the root. She decided to ask her family if they had faced any sorrow too. "How can I put it?" Eduardo began, but Manuela interrupted for a moment. "Here we are, where I reside." She pointed to the old 4-story house. "Let's sit on the bench and you can share everything unless you're in a rush." Eduardo felt a connection. "I've had a tough life too, so I understand you better than anyone. My only beloved son, Rafael, perished during a mission in a critical area. For obvious reasons, I can't specify where, as it was military confidential." He sighed. "I had so many dreams of having grandchildren. That's why I cherished my son." Eduardo continued. "We fished and hunted together, spending time at the cabin, enjoying nature. What more was needed for happiness?" He paused, gazing at the clouds, brushing his face as if wiping away tears. "I never had grandchildren. My son didn't bring me joy. 6 months after his death, my wife Leonore passed away. Her heart couldn't bear it. The doctors did nothing but declare her dead, and it all unfolded before my eyes. I felt like I'd fallen into a dark pit. My wife and son left me all alone. Maybe to live and suffer." "Don't say that. They didn't do it on purpose," Manuela tried to soothe him. "Yes, as you can see, even the wealthy weep." "You surprised me," Manuela said unexpectedly. "How so?" "I never would have thought a rich person could send their own child to a dangerous place to serve and protect their country." "I think it's normal," Eduardo replied. "Every man should be patriotic. Besides, my son made his own choice. I didn't push him. My wife and I offered him a career in our business, but he declined." "Your son was brave and valiant," Manuela added. "I'd even say responsible and determined." "Oh, there was no one like him in that regard," Eduardo agreed. "Rafael always set goals intelligently. He never backed down, no matter the obstacles." "We're having such a heartfelt conversation," Manuela said as she stood pointing to the entrance. "I'd like to go in and have a coffee." "Thank you, but with your permission, I'll decline," Eduardo replied, shaking his head. "I haven't been feeling well lately. The doctors mention a tumor and insist on surgery, but like a child, I keep postponing." "You're doing that in vain. I noticed your pallor immediately." Manuela shook her head. "Medicine has advanced these days. You shouldn't fear it. Besides, there are likely options for you in a private clinic." "Oh, I'm not afraid. I just don't have time," Eduardo forced a smile. "The pallor comes from blood pressure issues. It fluctuates, sometimes high, sometimes low. I take medications, but they don't always help." "That's exactly why you need an evaluation," Manuela urged. "Well, perhaps another time if I find the moment," Eduardo said. "I'll consult your husband. I'll try to learn something." "What a pity you declined the coffee," Manuela said. "I'll be waiting for news." After that, they exchanged phone numbers and said goodbye. Eduardo Silva was indeed unwell, but always postponed treatment. He didn't fear doctors, just had no one to manage his affairs, especially after the recent incident requiring reinforcement. Despite the fact that employees could easily take advantage and relax, he couldn't allow that, as it would mean admitting his own weakness. To begin his search, Eduardo needed the services of a detective, one of whom was Luis Souza. Before retiring, he worked as a senior investigator in the homicide division. Eduardo planned to meet him without delay, unlike his own illness, which he kept postponing. 40 minutes later, he arrived at the location and looked at the windows on the third floor where the detective lived, someone Eduardo had close ties with in his youth. As a young investigator, Luis had been involved in solving a boy's murder, where Eduardo was a suspect due to blood marks and the victim's fingerprints found in his home. It soon became clear he had been framed, and Souza proved it by tracking down the real criminal and making the arrest. The young investigator was rewarded, promoted, and later advanced in his career, eventually becoming a senior investigator. Just before retiring, he had the opportunity to serve as head of the department for 6 months. Luis greeted Eduardo with a smile, saying, "Eduardo, it's been a long time since we last met," as he embraced his guest and led him into the apartment, immediately taking him to the kitchen. "Let's have a drink to celebrate our reunion." "I won't refuse," Eduardo replied, giving his shoulder a pat. "We've been seeing each other less often lately. I've been fully immersed in my business." "And you're always busy," Eduardo responded, extending his arms. "That's why we don't meet as frequently as before. Thankfully, we still remember each other's addresses." "That's true, which means our brains are still functioning," Luis joked. "Well, let's drink." After emptying their glasses, they enjoyed a salad and slices of ham that the detective had carefully taken from the fridge. Notably, his apartment was impeccably tidy. Every object had its designated place. Even during his time as an investigator, Luis had developed iron discipline, which he maintained despite his wealth, allowing him to have help. "You know, Luis, I didn't come to you without reason," said Eduardo, pushing the salad plate away. "I already guessed that. With a reserved person like you, I sometimes have to pull every word out. After your son's death, you closed up even more. It must be a delicate topic for me," Eduardo replied, frustration evident in his voice. "I apologize, I went in the wrong direction," Luis said, waving his hands. "What happened? Tell me, I need your help." "As a detective," Eduardo responded, "I know you've earned more in this field than in the police." "Oh, really? So, Investigator Souza is not in vogue these days," Luis teased. "Why would that be? Your skills have always been highly valued, but this time I need a detective. Trust me, I came to you with a good offer that's hard to refuse." "All right, I'm listening closely. Please present it, preferably with specific details." "Today I met a wonderful woman named Manuela. We started talking and she told me the story of her husband's death. He was hitching a ride home when a truck driver lost control. The car fell into the river. They were unable to locate Andre's body. That was Manuela's husband's name." "So you found a partner for life and want to eliminate the competition," Luis joked again. "I appreciate your humor, but Leonor still holds a place in my heart," Eduardo replied with a disapproving tone. "Sorry, that was a poor joke. Go on." "So she buried an empty coffin with her husband's belongings," Eduardo continued, "but I have doubts about his death." "Why do you think that?" asked the detective. "If the car went into the river, there's a strong chance he simply got out. The current might have taken his body, and wild animals could have consumed him," the detective explained. "I thought of that too," Eduardo agreed. "However, I'm asking you to take on this case." "What did you say? Can you find him at least his body so Manuela can give him a proper burial?" "I can't promise anything," Luis shrugged, "but I'll do everything I can. Don't be offended if there's no positive outcome." "Of course, I understand, Eduardo responded. It's a challenging case. Traveling far offers no guarantee of finding anything. By the way, where did the accident occur? Let me jot down all the details Manuela provided me. Eduardo pulled out a notepad from his inner pocket, noting the scant information he had. It's not much, but it's something, Louise said, looking at the notes. I have a deal with a client to finish in a few days, and then I'll focus on your case. Just don't take too long. Of course, I've never let you down, the detective replied. Maybe another drink? I've had enough. My blood pressure is acting up, Eduardo declined. When you find this person for me, we'll have a sincere celebration. I'll even bring a 10-year-old cognac. Consider that settled. After parting ways, Eduardo went home, and Luis began calling his informants. He couldn't refuse to help his friend. After the case where Luis literally saved Eduardo from prison, a strong bond formed between them that had endured over the years, no matter how tough life got. As for Manuela, she hesitated to believe Eduardo would succeed. So much time had passed. The rescuers had assured her back then that it was all in vain. Besides, no one on the street had ever offered such help before, and suddenly the owner of a supermarket chain took on the search. She didn't believe in miracles, especially those that promised to fulfill any of her dreams. Yet, she still dreamed of being beside her husband again, even though she had grown used to facing her struggles alone. It wouldn't hurt to have his strong shoulder again, she thought, but she understood that dreams rarely came true. Her husband wouldn't return to life, and he wouldn't be the same as before. Manuela grew increasingly anxious, expecting less from Eduardo. Furthermore, he offered no encouragement, always responding on the phone when she called, "I'm searching, be patient." Of course, he could be understood. After all, he didn't possess a database of all the deceased in the country. But now, Manuela could no longer wait, because she genuinely wished for time to turn back. This continued until she realized the futility of her agitation. Weeks passed, then another week, and Eduardo had not provided any more news. From that moment on, Manuela ceased her waiting. Meanwhile, Luis was digging through the ground for information, utilizing all his connections to find the right people. You could say he was setting the gears of the story in reverse. He also made sure to keep Eduardo updated. Eduardo called him periodically, and Luis responded, "Eduardo, I've made some progress in that direction. I think everything will fall into place soon." This was more than enough for Eduardo to trust the detective's skills. Luis continued his search, and soon his efforts bore fruit. He found her, lost, and held on like a man clinging to a lifeline. That day, Manuela was home because she had the day off. She planned to spend quality time with her children, but unexpectedly there was a knock at the door. Not expecting any guests, she opened the door to her great surprise. In an instant, her face twisted in horror, for standing on the threshold was her husband, André. He looked pale, visibly thinner, and had a red scar on his forehead. Overwhelmed with joy at her husband's return, Manuela began to cry, drawing her children's attention. In a minute, they all gathered in the hallway, as if by magic, tears and exclamations of shock filling the apartment. Behind André stood Eduardo, smiling. It was clear his help had been indispensable. Manuela had doubted him, but he had fully met the expectations set upon him. André entered the apartment, surrounded on all sides by his children. For an hour, they did not cease their embraces and tears. Yet Manuela was more overwhelmed. She could hardly believe her eyes. Her husband was alive. She pinched herself twice, thinking she was dreaming, but everything was truly happening. André even tried to talk to her, but it didn't go well for him, likely due to stress and emotion. Finally, Eduardo took charge of the situation and firmly stated, "I think it's time to clarify some things. What do you think, André?" "Yes, it's about time," he agreed. André began his story by thanking everyone who had saved and participated in the search. The tragic event had occurred at night when he was on his way to meet his family. André was in such a rush that when the driver accelerated, he complied without thinking of the consequences on a winding road with sharp curves. It was on one of those bends that the car lost control. In an instant, the truck veered off the road and rolled toward the river. They didn't even have time to react as speed affected the impact's intensity. As a result, André's head struck a rock and the current carried him down the riverbed. Perhaps he would have continued floating until he drowned or was devoured by wild animals. However, André was fortunate as he was found by some hermits. They had settled in the forest and made a living fishing. When they came across his body, they initially thought he was dead, but upon pulling him from the water, they realized he was alive, just unconscious. The hermits took André to their humble cabin, where he spent a month in a delirious state, constantly calling out for people. No one could understand him as he whispered, barely forming words. What was happening around him? Occasionally, he would open his eyes only to fall back into forgetfulness. Curiously, the hermits did not abandon him. They continued to care for him, as if André had received a second chance at life. Gradually, he began to regain his senses, but could not remember anything connecting him to his past. André struggled to piece together the facts, time, and events, but failed to comprehend any of it. Frustrated and sad, he contemplated taking his own life, but the hermits intervened just in time. They gave him a temporary name since he couldn't recall his own, so André became João. He started helping his rescuers with fishing to support himself, as he could not just lie in the cabin staring at the ceiling. Additionally, he hoped that by doing this, he would eventually remember his past and find his way home. André understood that this place was not where he belonged. Time passed, yet clear thoughts about his past did not occur to him. Thus, André decided to seek help from the police. However, he had no identification since most had been lost during the accident, making it impossible to prove his identity. Nonetheless, André took the risk and tried to explain himself to the police, who listened but paid little attention, as they dealt with troublesome individuals all day, and André was no exception. Without assistance from the authorities, he returned to the cabin with a heavy heart. He even considered leaving, going wherever his eyes might take him, but the hermits brought him back to reason, preventing him from making hasty decisions. He stayed, yet help soon arrived from an unexpected source. André could hardly believe his luck when strangers approached him and shared facts about his past life. He listened for an entire hour to what he had longed to remember. Then, the detective arrived and explained the purpose of his visit. Luis carefully prepared André for the rehabilitation process, as it was necessary to restore his memory and bring him back to a stable condition. After learning of the search's results, Eduardo was the first to visit him at the clinic. "How are you feeling?" "Better, but still a bit nauseous," André replied. "That happens. It will pass. The most important thing is to regain your strength," Eduardo reassured him. "Are you sure this will help?" André looked around the room. "Of course, the best doctors in the area work here at the clinic." André received assistance to cope with the negative effects of amnesia. Slowly, he remembered a significant part of the events from his past life and was thrilled to discover he had a wife and 4 children. André even shed tears when Eduardo visited again. "Do you understand how lucky you are to have a family?" he asked. "Yes, that's absolutely true. They can't wait to see you," Eduardo replied, patting his shoulder. "I can't wait for therapy to finish, so I can go home and be loved a little more." "Hang in there," Eduardo assured him. After some time, André was discharged from the hospital, beaming as he practically ran out of the medical facility. Eduardo took him to his place to finalize preparations. At the door of his apartment, though looking somewhat pale and thinner upon hearing her husband's story, Manuela burst into bitter tears. "I had already grieved you," she admitted. "Forgive me, my love. I'm so ashamed." "Don't blame yourself, you had no way of knowing," André tried to comfort her. "We should thank Mr. Silva for arranging the search for me. We owe him so much." Manuela turned to him. "We will forever be in your debt." Stop that. No repayment is needed, Eduardo rebuked gently. It's enough that you let me help your family. It's all part of divine providence, Manuela implored. I never imagined such kind people existed. From that day forward, Eduardo Silva embraced Manuela and Andre's family, deciding not to leave those who had suffered so much. Once Andre fully recovered, Eduardo arranged for him to work as a supplier, distributing goods to stores. Andre enjoyed this role as he had finally rejoined society. Unbeknownst to him, Eduardo became like a beloved grandfather to Manuela and Andre's children. He visited so frequently that the family began to consider him part of their own, especially their youngest daughter, who beamed whenever Eduardo appeared at their home. However, one day Eduardo fell ill and was urgently admitted to the hospital. He initially resisted, but the doctors insisted, reminding him of the tumor supposedly detected during an earlier exam. With no other options, Eduardo agreed, particularly since he had been feeling worse recently. Manuela was deeply concerned and visited him almost daily. Andre also came by to reassure the man, telling him everything would turn out fine. Or at least that's what he wanted to believe. Eduardo remained hopeful, especially knowing he had people who truly cared for him by his side. But after a few days, Eduardo's condition worsened, and the doctors determined he needed a blood transfusion. It was soon discovered that Eduardo had a rare blood type, and none of his relatives were compatible. Time was running out, possibly within minutes. The news reached the clinic where Andre was undergoing his rehabilitation therapy. Eduardo was shocked, but gave his consent for the procedure. The doctor informed them that their blood types were genotypically similar. Eduardo could hardly believe it was possible. After the transfusion, Eduardo insisted on DNA testing. All samples were sent to the lab for analysis, and they awaited the results. Meanwhile, Eduardo began to recover and quickly informed Manuela and Andre about the developments. That same day, they rushed to the clinic to congratulate him in person. As you can see, medicine really works wonders, Eduardo said proudly. I told you they'd help you. Manuela nodded, her joy evident. And most importantly, a huge thanks to Andre, Eduardo continued. If it weren't for him, I probably wouldn't be speaking to you now. Oh, stop. All I did was give you my blood for the transfusion, Andre replied modestly. And that's what saved me, Eduardo said, raising his index finger. However, he still hadn't mentioned to Andre the DNA test he had requested, as he couldn't reveal such information before confirming its accuracy. So he remained composed, all thanks to the doctor's efforts. Eduardo Silva felt better with each passing day. He no longer felt fatigued, and the headaches that had once plagued him had vanished. Finally, the results arrived, and Eduardo was astounded to learn that Andre was his son. But how could that be? Rafael was the only person he considered true family, into whom he had poured his heart and soul. To dispel his doubts, Eduardo turned once more to Luis, who led a new investigation. The findings he uncovered were utterly shocking. Eduardo had just been discharged from the hospital and returned home to find Manuela and Andre waiting for him, having prepared a lavish meal and gathered the children. Upon seeing them, Eduardo asked them to follow him to the living room, where he needed to have a serious conversation. Did they not cure you completely? Manuela asked anxiously. Is everything all right? Eduardo shook his head. They did an excellent job, even better than expected, but I have some different information to share. We're all ears, Andre replied. How do I put this? Eduardo hesitated. It seems that you, Andre, are my son. Andre fell from his chair upon hearing this, instantly breaking into a sweat, his face draining of color. Manuela's eyes widened in disbelief. She had never expected such news. I can't believe it. How is that possible? Andre asked, recovering from the shock. I couldn't believe it at first either, Eduardo replied, but I read everything and convinced myself it's true. He handed Andre the DNA test results document. Andre carefully read it, running his hand through his hair. This is truly shocking news, he stated after a moment of confusion. I'm sorry, but I had to conduct the DNA test, Eduardo continued. After they found the donor in you, I was informed our blood types were similar. I didn't believe it, and that's when the doctors provided evidence. But I still don't understand how this could have happened, Andre interrupted. We'll figure it out soon, Eduardo responded. I'll ask our detective to gather all the information about my son's birth. A few hours later, the doorbell rang again. It was Luis. Good morning, he greeted cheerfully, beginning to provide the information. It turned out there had been a fire at the maternity ward where Eduardo's wife was hospitalized. However, Eduardo only learned of this upon returning from a business trip. He was assured that his wife was unharmed and everything was fine, but he was also informed about the birth of a son. Initially, it seemed like an incident that could be considered resolved, but no one could have predicted that the babies would be swapped due to the medical staff's negligence. Amidst the chaos of the fire, all the infants were moved to another room. Unfortunately, the tags identifying Eduardo's child and another baby were lost. When the fire was contained, everything was returned to its place, albeit incorrectly. The children were essentially swapped, and Eduardo's wife received another person's baby. Luis concluded his story, looking at his audience with gratitude. The revelation then seems like I've raised someone else's child my entire life, he asked, astonished. It appears so, Luis replied, a hint of sadness in his voice, but I see nothing wrong with it. The important thing is, you considered him your son. You're right, Eduardo agreed, but it's still a lot to take in. You devoted your heart to him, Manuela supported, and he's grateful for that. So, Andre, my only son, Eduardo declared, and I knew nothing about him. It's not your fault, the detective reassured. Instead, think of the joy you've gained. If someone told me I'd find my child, I'd leap for joy. I'm truly happy, just a bit confused at the moment. That's okay, everything will be fine. The key is to accept this fact, Luis concluded. Well, it seems my mission here is done. I must leave you now. Thank you very much, Manuela expressed. You've done so much for our family. I'll pray for you for the rest of my life. I honestly didn't expect this, Luis said, flustered, but thank you as well. If you need anything, I'm always available. Just call me, Eduardo felt in response. As Manuela was bidding farewell to the guest, he finally regained his composure and embraced Andre in a fatherly way. He truly realized his own son was before him, tears streaming down the old man's face, and he didn't even try to hide them. Andre was also moved as he witnessed such significant events in his life for the second time recently. Manuela invited everyone to celebrate this important occasion. The reunion of father and son couldn't go unnoticed. Eduardo spent the night at their house, sleeping in the children's room. But before that, he spent an entire hour telling stories to his grandkids. Now, he was the true grandfather, not just a guest, and he could shower them with all his love, which he did. The next day, he invited everyone to his villa, where he had a large house to escape the city's noise. Manuela noticed a small structure resembling a chapel and cautiously asked him, "Is it in honor of your wife and son?" "Yes, you're right," Eduardo felt. "I built it shortly after Raphael's death and later added my wife's initials too. They're buried together in the cemetery. It's our family chapel. I come here to find solace and talk to them." "I understand. I won't disturb you." Manuela left him alone and asked the kids not to bother their grandfather for now. Meanwhile, while watching his father stand near the chapel, Andre approached, removed his hat, and silently made the sign of the cross for a few minutes, each lost in their thoughts. Drying his face, Eduardo turned to his son and said, "I hope not to lose you again." "That won't happen, Dad," Andre replied, hugging his father tightly. Manuela observed this scene from a distance, feeling joy within because fate had returned her husband alive, and he had given a father-in-law as well. It seemed these events were not meant to happen in her life. They spent several days in the countryside, relaxing, bonding, and having fun. Meanwhile, Eduardo decided to make Andre his business partner, and to not waste any more time while still alive, he enrolled him in an accelerated financial education course. At first, Andre was hesitant, but under his wife's urging, he agreed, especially considering the promising prospects this offered. Eduardo confessed to himself, "I'm not immortal, and I need a successor." There's no one else to pass the business to. I honestly thought everything would be lost after my death." "Why think that?" "Things are going well after all," said Andre. "It only seems that way." Eduardo shook his head. "I've had one foot in the beyond for too long. Leonor and Raphael are waiting for me there. I see them in my dreams every night." "That's okay. We have an agreement. I'll try to understand the complexities of the business, and you promise to set those thoughts aside," Andre replied. During the courses, Andre absorbed all the information provided by the instructors, took meticulous notes, and practiced his skills, realizing that in the future there would be no one else to guide him. He was preparing to face any challenges that might arise. Eduardo also didn't neglect his grandchildren. He created the most favorable and comfortable conditions for them, as he had confessed that Raphael didn't have the chance to give them this, but at least Andre did. He brought 4 grandchildren into his life. Eduardo spent time with them almost every day, showering them with affection. Eventually, he decided that fresh air was much healthier and moved the family to that house in the countryside, which essentially became his property, as Eduardo made it clear that all his assets would be passed down to them. He waited until his son fully immersed himself in the business before handing over the reins of power. All those years, Eduardo had been like a squirrel on a wheel. It was time to make way for the younger generation and let them show what they were capable of. Andre proudly accepted this gift and promised that the stores would thrive under his leadership. He had already taken the first steps. However, many challenges remained. The supermarket chain gained prominence in the city, its reputation spreading throughout the region and even at the federal level. This naturally led to an influx of investments, putting the entire family in the spotlight. After some time, Andre sincerely confessed to his wife, "I never thought recovering my memory would have so many consequences." "I also didn't expect our lives to change so drastically," Manuela replied. Having entrusted the business to his son, Eduardo Silva dedicated himself entirely to his grandchildren. He moved to the house in the countryside and spent all his free time with them, who were thrilled with their grandfather's company because he loved to tell fantastic stories about life.